Miami's biggest win may have saved Boston's dynasty. Stop whatever you're doing. Because the biggest NBA story isn't just that Giannis Antetokounmpo is heading to Miami. That's the headline. But the real story, the one almost nobody is talking about, could completely change how the Eastern Conference unfolds for years to come. Hidden behind the blockbuster trade is a shocking truth. The Miami Heat may have accidentally saved the Boston Celtics from making the biggest mistake in franchise history. Think about that for a second. While everyone is celebrating Miami's newest superstar and debating whether the Heat just became title favorites, very few people realize how close Boston came to destroying the championship core that finally brought Banner 18 back to TD Garden. Jaylen Brown, the reigning Finals MVP. The player who delivered in the biggest moments, the man who stood beside Jayson Tatum through years of heartbreak before reaching the top of the mountain, was reportedly at the center of trade discussions. Not because he failed, not because he disappointed, not because Boston wanted to rebuild, but because Giannis Antetokounmpo became available. For one terrifying stretch behind closed doors, Boston's front office reportedly considered sacrificing the very player who helped complete their championship dream in exchange for one of the greatest talents of this generation. Imagine being Jaylen Brown. You spend years hearing critics say you and Tatum can't win together. You survive every trade rumor. You silence every doubter. You help deliver a championship. You earn Finals MVP. And then, almost immediately, your name becomes the centerpiece of another blockbuster negotiation. If that's true, what message does that send? What does loyalty mean in today's NBA? And what happens inside a locker room when a superstar discovers that even after winning it all, he's still considered expendable? Those questions are just as important as Giannis wearing a Heat jersey. Because this isn't only a story about Miami getting stronger, it's a story about trust. It's a story about business versus brotherhood. It's a story about one championship organization nearly gambling everything it had built and another organization unknowingly preventing that gamble from ever becoming reality. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some executives quietly believe the Heat didn't just change their own future, they may have rescued Boston's future as well. We'll break down how Milwaukee's decline led to this moment, why Boston was willing to risk its championship chemistry, how Miami won the race, and why Jaylen Brown may enter next season with more motivation than ever before. Before we dive into everything, let me know where you're watching from today. If you believe this near miss could make Boston even more dangerous next season, type 1-inch the comment. If you think they should have traded for Giannis no matter the cost, type 2. And if you enjoy deep NBA stories that go beyond the headlines, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because the next chapters only get more unbelievable. How Milwaukee reached the breaking point. To understand why this trade became possible, you have to understand what happened in Milwaukee before the phone calls ever started. The Bucks were not falling apart overnight. They were slipping slowly, quietly, painfully. After the 2021 championship, Milwaukee believed it had built something that could last. Giannis was in his prime. The city trusted him. The organization had its superstar, its banner, and its identity. But in the NBA, a championship window does not stay open just because a franchise wants it to. The roster around Giannis started aging. Injuries arrived at the worst moments. The supporting pieces became less explosive, less reliable, and less capable of surviving deep playoff battles. Every season, the gap between Milwaukee and the true elite teams became harder to ignore. Giannis kept doing his part. He still attacked the rim like a force of nature. He still carried impossible burdens. He still gave Milwaukee nights where he looked like the most dominant player alive. But even greatness has limits when the structure around it begins to crack. Inside the league, people noticed, executives noticed, players noticed, and eventually, the question became unavoidable. How long would Giannis keep believing? That is when the whispers started turning into real conversations. Not public demands, not loud drama, but the kind of quiet, league-wide movement that happens when teams sense a superstar may be available before the world fully realizes it. The Bucks had to face a brutal truth. If Giannis was no longer certain about the future, they could not wait until they had no leverage. They had to listen. And once they listened, every ambitious front office in the league understood the same thing. This was not a normal trademark. This was Giannis Antetokounmpo, a two-time MVP, a champion, a defensive monster, a player who can reshape an entire franchise the second he walks into the building. And that is when Boston and Miami stepped forward with two very different dreams. Boston's dangerous dream? Boston did not enter the Giannis conversation casually. The Celtics were not some desperate team throwing names at a wall. They were champions. They had Jayson Tatum. They had Jaylen Brown. They had a culture, a defensive identity, and the confidence of a franchise that had finally climbed the mountain after years of pain. But great teams are often tempted by the chance to become historic. That was the danger. On paper, the idea was terrifying. Imagine Giannis beside Tatum and Brown. 3 elite athletes, 3 powerful bodies, 3 stars who could defend, run, switch, attack, and overwhelm opponents from every angle. In a conference built around wings, size, spacing, and playoff versatility, Boston saw a possible super team that could dominate for years. That vision was almost too seductive to ignore. The front office could imagine it, the coaching staff could draw it up, ownership could see the ratings, the banners, the global attention. A Celtics team with Giannis, Tatum, and Brown would not just be a contender, it would become a nightmare. But the problem with dreams is that they usually come with a price. Milwaukee was not going to hand over Giannis for role players and hopeful draft picks. The Bucks wanted real value. They wanted someone who could keep them relevant immediately. They wanted a player who had already proven he could perform under championship pressure. And that is when the conversation changed, because Milwaukee kept coming back to one name, Jaylen Brown. The moment Brown's name entered the room, this stopped being a bold basketball idea and became something far more dangerous. Boston was no longer simply chasing greatness. Boston was considering whether to sacrifice part of its soul to get it. That is where the real drama begins. Because when a franchise puts a finals MVP on the table, even quietly, even briefly, everyone involved feels the temperature change. The name that changed everything. Jaylen Brown was not just another asset. That is the part people cannot forget. This was not a young prospect who had not developed. This was not an expensive contract Boston regretted. This was not a player who disappeared when the lights got bright. Jaylen Brown had just delivered on the biggest stage in basketball. He defended. He scored. He answered pressure. He gave Boston physicality, toughness, and emotional stability when the franchise needed it most. When the Celtics finally reached the top again, Brown was not standing in the background. He was at the center of it. Finals MVP is not a small label. It follows a player forever. And yet, in the middle of the Giannis pursuit, that same player reportedly became the piece Milwaukee wanted most. From the Bucks side, it made perfect sense. If you are giving up Giannis, you cannot sell your fan base on empty promises. You need a star. You need credibility. You need someone who can walk into the building and instantly give the organization a new direction. Jaylen Brown checked every box. He was in his prime. He was battle-tested. He could defend elite wings. He could score without needing the entire offense built around him. He had championship experience and the kind of competitive edge that serious teams value. Milwaukee was not being emotional. They were being smart. But for Boston, this was different. Trading Brown would not just change the roster. It would send a message through the locker room that nobody, not even the man who helped deliver the championship, was untouchable. That kind of message can motivate a team. It can also break one because players remember. They remember who believed in them, who doubted them, and who was willing to move them when something shinier appeared. And Jaylen Brown had every reason to remember them. What Jaylen Brown must have felt, imagine being Jaylen Brown when that information reaches you. You do everything a franchise could ask. You stay through criticism. You handle trade rumors. You grow with Jayson Tatum. You survive years of national debate about whether the partnership can work. Then you help win the championship and walk away as finals MVP. For most players, that should create security. For Brown, it may have created a different kind of truth. The truth that in the NBA, even victory does not always protect you. That is a cold reality. Because this was not about failure. Brown was not being discussed because he came up short. He was not being moved because Boston needed a rebuild. He was being considered because Giannis became available. And when a generational player appears on the market, loyalty suddenly gets tested. That is where the emotional damage begins. A player can understand business and still feel disrespected. He can know how trades work and still wonder why his name was not protected. He can remain professional and still carry the memory of almost being sent away after delivering the greatest moment of his career. That kind of feeling does not vanish because a deal falls apart. It sits in the back of the mind. Every front office conversation feels different. Every public compliment sounds a little safer. Every statement about commitment becomes something that has to be proven, not just spoken. And for the Celtics, that is the challenge now. They did not trade Jaylen Brown, but they may have shown him that they were willing to consider it. That matters because trust is not rebuilt through press conferences. It is rebuilt through action, through honesty, through respect, through showing a player that he is more than a number on a trade board. Jaylen Brown does not need redemption, but he may now have a new reason to remind everyone exactly who he is. The cost Boston almost paid. Basketball fans love blockbuster trades because they look clean from the outside. One star goes here, another player goes there. Analysts grade the deal. Social media explodes. Everybody debates who won. But inside a real team, the cost is never that simple. If Boston had traded Jaylen Brown for Giannis, the Celtics would not just be changing talent. They would be changing chemistry, rhythm, leadership, and history. they would be ending the partnership that carried them through some of the hardest years in modern Celtics basketball. Tatum and Brown did not become champions by accident. They grew through failure. They heard the criticism. They were told they could not play together. They were told one of them had to go. They lost painful playoff series, faced national doubt, and still kept building until the final result spoke louder than every take. That kind of bond is rare. You cannot create it in a trade machine. Giannis is an extraordinary player, but even extraordinary players need time to fit. The offense changes, the spacing changes, the hierarchy changes, the locker room changes. Tatum would have to adjust. The role players would have to adjust. The entire identity of the team would shift around a new superstar with a completely different style. Could it have worked? Maybe. Could it have become dominant? Absolutely. But it was not guaranteed. And that is what made the risk so massive. Boston would have been trading something proven for something theoretical. A championship duo for a bigger dream. A known identity for a more explosive but uncertain future. That is the kind of gamble that can make a front office look brilliant. It can also haunt a franchise for a decade. Every Brown highlight in another jersey would become a reminder. Every Celtics loss would become a debate. Every playoff failure would bring the same painful question. Did Boston outsmart itself? That is the price the Celtics almost paid. How Miami won the race. Miami's victory was not just about wanting Giannis. Everybody wanted Giannis. Miami won because the Heat understood the moment, moved with purpose, and built an offer Milwaukee could actually accept without forcing the same emotional explosion Boston was facing. That is the difference. Pat Riley has never been afraid of the big swing. His entire basketball life has been built around one belief. When a true superstar becomes available, hesitation is dangerous. You do not wait for the perfect moment. You create it. That is exactly what Miami did. The Heat looked at their roster and understood the truth. They had culture. They had toughness. They had coaching. They had a respected organization. But they needed a new centerpiece, a player powerful enough to redefine their ceiling and give the franchise another real title window. Giannis was that player. For Miami, the fit was obvious. His physical dominance matched the Heat's identity, his work ethic matched their culture, his desire to compete matched the standard the organization sells to every player who walks through the door. But the real key was the packet. Miami found a way to give Milwaukee a cleaner path forward. Youth, flexibility, depth, future value, the kind of rebuild material that made sense from the Bucks' perspective. Milwaukee did not just need names. They needed a direction. Miami gave them one, and because Miami was able to satisfy Milwaukee without forcing Boston's nightmare into reality, the Heat did something ironic. They got stronger, and they saved Boston from itself. The Bucks got their reset, Miami got its superstar, Boston kept Jaylen Brown, and the entire Eastern Conference changed in one move. That is why this trade is so layered. It is not just about who landed Giannis. It is about who avoided disaster. Miami won the headline, but Boston may have won something just as important. A second chance with the core, it almost broke. The league's reaction when the trade became official, the NBA did not react like this was just another star changing teams. This felt different. Players were shocked by the destination. Fans were stunned by the timing. Analysts immediately started rebuilding the Eastern Conference in their heads. Miami with Giannis was not just dangerous. It was uncomfortable for everyone else. Because the Heat already had a reputation. They are disciplined, they are physical, they are prepared, they make playoff series ugly, they find advantages in places other teams ignore, and now they had one of the most physically overwhelming players in modern NBA history walking into that system. That combination scared people. But underneath the reaction to Miami, there was another conversation happening across the league. Jaylen Brown. Players understood what almost happened. They understood that a finals MVP had reportedly been placed into serious trade discussions by the very team he helped lift to a championship. And that detail hit differently because players know the business better than fans do. They know loyalty is complicated. They know front offices speak warmly in public while evaluating every option in private. But still, there is something jarring about seeing a player reach the absolute top and still not be fully safe. That is why the sympathy for Brown was real. Not loud sympathy, not dramatic public speeches, but the kind of quiet recognition that spreads among players who understand the emotional cost of the business. If winning finals MVP does not guarantee stability, then what does? That question now follows Boston. It follows Jaylen. It follows every conversation about what the Celtics do next. And for opponents, it creates another problem. A wounded, motivated Jaylen Brown may be even more dangerous than a comfortable one. He now has proof that some people still see him as movable, still see his value as negotiable, still believe there is a bigger prize somewhere else. That is fuel, and NBA history is full of great players turning fuel into fire. The 3 possible endings. There are really only 3 ways this story can end, but none of them are simple, and none of them come without consequences that could reshape the entire NBA landscape for years. The first ending is reconciliation. On paper, this is the cleanest outcome. Boston keeps Jaylen Brown, the front office sits down with both of its stars, and everything gets addressed internally. The trade rumors are explained as due diligence. The intention is reframed as exploring options, not replacing people. And the organization tries to reset the emotional balance inside the locker room. But here's the problem. Reconciliation in the NBA is never just about words. It's about trust. And trust, once shaken at this level, does not return because someone says, "We're good now." It returns through repeated actions over time. Jaylen Brown would have to believe it, Jayson Tatum would have to feel it, role players would have to see it, and the coaching staff would have to enforce it. Because if even one piece feels off, the entire structure becomes unstable again. Still, if it works, Boston becomes dangerous in a different way. A team that survives internal tension and still chooses unity often develops an edge most opponents cannot measure. That kind of emotional fire can turn into playoff dominance. The second ending is the blockbuster trade reality. Boston pulls the trigger, Jaylen Brown is moved, the duo is broken, the franchise commits fully to Jayson Tatum as the sole centerpiece. Everything becomes about retooling, not maintaining. In this version, the Celtics accept that evolution sometimes requires pain. They trade away a finals MVP, but they receive a package designed to extend their championship window in a new direction. Picks, young talent, maybe even another borderline star. The identity shifts overnight. But there is no guarantee it works. Because trading a player like Jaylen Brown does not just remove production. It removes chemistry, continuity, and a psychological anchor that the team has built over years. Tatum would have to adjust to a completely new ecosystem. The locker room would reset. The fan base would split into 2 emotional camps. Those who understand the move and those who never forgive it. And every single Celtics loss after that would be compared to what was lost, not what was gained. The third ending is the most dangerous. Limbo. Jaylen stays, but nothing feels fully resolved. The front office moves on publicly, but internally the question remains. The locker room tries to focus on basketball, but the media keeps pulling the story back into uncertainty. Every slow start becomes speculation, every sideline reaction becomes analysis, every stretch of inconsistency becomes fuel for doubt. This is the silent killer of NBA dynasties. Not trades, not injuries, not even bad roster construction. Uncertainty. Because uncertainty spreads. It affects communication on the court. It affects trust in late game situations. It affects how players interpret coaching decisions, and over time, it changes the identity of a team that once felt unified. So Boston is left with a brutal reality. They must choose clarity over comfort. Even if the answer is not perfect, it has to be definitive, because the worst position in professional basketball is not being wrong. It is being unsure. The lesson, the fallout, and what comes next. Every major NBA story eventually becomes more than basketball. It becomes a reflection of how modern sports actually function. Business decisions wrapped inside human relationships, loyalty tested against ambition, and championships balanced on emotional stability as much as talent. This situation is exactly that. Miami made its move. They did not hesitate. They did not overthink. They identified a generational player in Giannis Antetokounmpo and acted with full conviction. That kind of aggression is what organizations like the Heat are built on. When a window opens, they do not observe it, they break through it. And now they have a franchise-changing superstar. Milwaukee, meanwhile, accepted reality. Whether fans like it or not, the Bucks understood that the championship window built around their previous core had reached its natural limit. Instead of delaying the inevitable, they pivoted. They chose future flexibility over emotional attachment. That is the part of the story that often gets overlooked. Sometimes the smartest move is not maximizing the present, but protecting what comes next. But Boston's story is different because Boston did not actually complete the trade. They did not lose Jaylen Brown. They did not commit to Giannis. They lived inside the most dangerous space in sports, the space between almost and actually. They came close enough to feel the weight of the decision, but not close enough to finalize it. And that changes everything. For Jaylen Brown, that experience becomes fuel. Even if he never publicly acknowledges it in detail, players remember these moments. They remember how close they came to being moved. They remember how quickly loyalty can shift when a bigger name becomes available, and that memory often turns into performance. Not louder celebrations, not social media statements, but a different kind of intensity on the court. A sharper edge, a refusal to be overlooked again, a mindset that every possession matters a little more than before. For Jayson Tatum, the message is also clear. The franchise is willing to explore bold moves to win. That creates pressure, but also responsibility. Leadership becomes more defined. The margin for almost disappears. Everything becomes about execution, not potential. And for the Celtics front office, this is the real test, because surviving a near disaster is not the same as solving it. They must now decide whether this moment becomes a warning that strengthens their unity or a hidden fracture that slowly expands under pressure. The truth is, championship teams are not only built on talent, they are built on clarity. Everyone knows their role. Everyone understands their value. Everyone trusts the direction. If Boston achieves that again, they remain a title contender. If they do not, no amount of talent will save them. Because in the modern NBA, instability does not explode immediately. It leaks, it grows quietly, it shows up in small moments before it becomes visible in big ones. A missed rotation, a late pass, a hesitation in crunch time, a frustration that was never fully addressed. That is how great teams fall apart, not suddenly, but gradually. Meanwhile, the Eastern Conference has fundamentally changed. Miami is now a legitimate powerhouse with a physical, unstoppable centerpiece. Every contender must adjust their defensive identity. Every coach must rethink matchup. Every playoff projection now runs through South Beach. But even with all of that, the most fascinating storyline is still Boston, because they are the team that didn't move, the team that almost changed everything, and the team that now has to prove that keeping the past intact was the right decision for the future. So the final question is simple but uncomfortable. Did Boston survive a disaster, or did they simply delay one? That answer will not come in headline. It will come in games, in pressure moments, in playoff possessions when trust matters more than talent. And when that moment arrives, we will find out whether the Celtics are still a championship machine or a dynasty standing one decision away from collapse.